The evening sun cast long golden shadows across Fifth Avenue as Grace Chen hurried down the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the pavement. She clutched her small backpack tightly, weaving through tourists and business people with the practiced ease of someone who had walked this route 1,000 times before. At 24, Grace had perfected the art of being invisible, head down, shoulders slightly hunched, moving through the world like a whisper. The violet crown rose before her like a monument to wealth and excess. The restaurant's facade gleamed with polished brass and floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed glimpses of crystal chandeliers and pristine white tablecloths. Luxury vehicles lined the curb, Mercedes, Bentleys, the occasional Rolls-Royce, as valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for women in designer gowns and men in $1,000 suits. Grace slipped past the main entrance, taking the side alley to the staff door. The contrast was jarring. Where the front entrance smelled of expensive perfume and fresh flowers, the back alley reeked of garbage and grease from the kitchen vents. She punched her time card, 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes early as always, and made her way to the cramped women's locker room. "Another day in paradise," muttered Sarah, one of the other waitresses, as she adjusted her black uniform in the mirror. Sarah was in her late 30s, a single mother who had worked at the Violet Crown for 6 years. Her eyes held the particular weariness of someone who had stopped dreaming long ago. Grace offered a small smile and changed quickly into her own uniform. Black slacks, white button-down shirt, black vest. She pulled her dark hair back into a neat bun, not a strand out of place. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The uniform had a way of erasing identity, turning individuals into interchangeable servants. "Richard's in a mood today," Sarah warned, lowering her voice. "The Kensington party canceled their reservation for Saturday. 20 people. He's been screaming at everyone." Grace's stomach tightened. Richard Beaumont, the restaurant's general manager, was a tall, sharp-featured man in his early 40s who wore his authority like armor. He had managed the Violet Crown for 8 years, ruling the staff with an iron fist disguised as professional standards. Grace had worked under him for 2 years, and she had learned that the best strategy was silence and obedience. "I'll stay out of his way," Grace said quietly. Sarah shook her head. "Honey, you can't stay out of his way. None of us can. Just keep your head down, okay?" The dining room was already preparing for the evening service. The maitre d', a distinguished older man named Pierre, was reviewing the reservation list with his usual meticulous attention. The sommelier was arranging wine glasses with geometric precision. Busboys were making final adjustments to table settings, ensuring every fork and knife was positioned exactly 1 inch from the table's edge. Grace took her assigned section, tables 12 through 18, a cluster near the kitchen that was generally reserved for less important guests. She began her pre-service routine, checking water glasses for spots, ensuring salt and pepper shakers were full, straightening the small votive candles that sat at the center of each table. "Grace!" She jumped at the sound of Richard's voice cutting through the quiet preparation. He stood near the host stand, his expression severe, his tablet gripped in one hand like a weapon. "Yes, sir?" Grace approached quickly, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. "Table 16, the Wentworths. They've been coming here for 15 years. Mrs. Wentworth is extremely particular about her water. Room temperature, no ice, lemon on the side. Mr. Wentworth takes his Manhattan with Woodford Reserve, never anything else. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. Room temperature water, lemon on the side. Manhattan with Woodford Reserve. Don't embarrass me tonight, Grace. The Wentworths are friends with the owner. One mistake, and you'll be looking for a new job." Richard's pale blue eyes bore into her. "Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." He dismissed her with a wave, already turning to berate one of the busboys about the angle of a napkin fold. Grace returned to her section, her hands trembling slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs, willing herself to be calm. She needed this job. The rent on her studio apartment in Queens was due in a week. Her mother's medical bills from last year's surgery were still being paid off in monthly installments. At 6:30 p.m., the first guests began arriving. The Violet Crown filled quickly. By 7 o'clock, nearly every table was occupied by Manhattan's elite. Hedge fund managers, fashion designers, old money families whose names appeared on museum wings and hospital buildings. The air hummed with the sound of cultured conversation, clinking crystal, and carefully modulated laughter. Grace moved through her section with practiced efficiency. She had learned to read guests quickly, who wanted attentive service, who preferred to be left alone, who would tip well, who would complain regardless of how perfect everything was. She smiled politely, spoke only when necessary, and made herself as unobtrusive as possible. Table 14 was occupied by a young couple celebrating an anniversary. They were kind, easy to please. Table 15 held a group of businessmen who barely acknowledged her existence, treating her like a piece of furniture that occasionally brought them food and drink. Table 16 remained empty, reserved for the Wentworths. At 7:45 p.m., something changed in the atmosphere of the restaurant. Grace was refilling water glasses at table 13 when she felt it, a shift in the energy of the room, as if the air pressure had suddenly dropped. Conversations didn't stop, but they seemed to quiet slightly. Pierre, the maître d', straightened his posture, his professional smile becoming even more polished. A man had entered the restaurant. Grace glanced toward the entrance, curious about what could command such subtle attention. The man stood speaking with Pierre, and even from across the room, his presence was arresting. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair that fell just past his collar in a style that was somehow both careless and perfect. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months, fitted to his frame with the precision that only bespoke tailoring could achieve. But it was his face that held her attention for that brief moment. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that even at this distance seemed to look through people rather than at them. He couldn't have been older than 35, yet there was something ancient in the way he held himself, a stillness that suggested absolute control. "More water, please." Grace snapped back to attention, realizing she had been staring. The woman at table 13 was holding up her empty glass with barely concealed impatience. "Of course, I'm so sorry." Grace quickly filled the glass, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at her unprofessional behavior. When she looked again, Pierre was escorting the dark-haired man to table 9, a corner booth that offered a view of the entire dining room while maintaining a sense of privacy. It was one of the best tables in the restaurant, usually reserved weeks in advance. Grace forced herself to focus on her own section. The Wentworths had arrived, a silver-haired couple in their 70s who carried themselves with the confidence of people who had never known financial worry. Grace greeted them warmly, recited the specials, and took their drink orders exactly as Richard had instructed. "Room temperature water for you, Mrs. Wentworth, with lemon on the side. And a Manhattan with Woodford Reserve for you, Mr. Wentworth. I'll have those right out." Mrs. Wentworth nodded approvingly. "You're new, aren't you, dear?" "I've been here for 2 years, ma'am, but this is the first time I've had the pleasure of serving your table." "Well, you seem very capable. We'll see how the evening goes." Grace smiled and retreated to the service station, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. 2 years at the Violet Crown, and she still felt anxious every time she approached a table. Sarah had once told her that confidence was the most important quality in fine dining service, but confidence was something Grace had never possessed. She prepared the Wentworths' drinks with meticulous care, ensuring the Manhattan was perfect. The right ratio of whiskey to vermouth, the correct number of dashes of bitters, garnished with a Luxardo cherry rather than the cheaper alternatives. She placed both drinks on her tray and headed back to table 16. That's when she saw Richard watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable but intense. She felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. "Your drinks," Grace said, placing them carefully on the table. "Have you had a chance to review the menu?" The Wentworths ordered. Filet mignon for him, Dover sole for her, and Grace entered their order into the computer system with careful precision. So far, so good. The evening continued. Grace brought appetizers, cleared plates, refilled wine glasses. The rhythm of service was almost meditative when everything went smoothly, a carefully choreographed dance of timing and anticipation. At table 12, a woman in her 50s asked about the restaurant's history, and Grace shared what she knew, that the Violet Crown had been founded in 1987 by restaurateur Jonathan Ashford, that it had earned its first Michelin star within 2 years, that it had been a Manhattan institution for nearly 4 decades. "You know your facts," the woman said approvingly. "So few young people care about history anymore." I think it's important to understand the places we work, Grace replied softly. The Violet Crown has a legacy. I'm just grateful to be a small part of it. It was true. Despite Richard's harsh management style, despite the exhausting shifts and the demanding clientele, Grace felt a sense of pride in working at such an establishment. It was so much more than the diner where she had worked through college, or the catering job she had taken to make ends meet before landing this position. She was so focused on her section that she almost forgot about the dark-haired man at table 9. Almost. But occasionally, as she moved through the dining room, she would feel the weight of someone's gaze, and when she glanced over, she would find him watching, not staring exactly. His attention seemed to drift across the entire restaurant, but there was something deliberate about the way his eyes would pause on her for just a moment longer than necessary. It made her uncomfortable. Men like that, wealthy, powerful, impossibly attractive, didn't look at women like Grace unless they wanted something. And in her experience, what they wanted was usually service delivered with a smile and then to be forgotten as soon as they left. At 8:30 p.m., Grace was carrying a tray of desserts to table 14 when it happened. The dining room floor at the Violet Crown was polished marble, beautiful but treacherous when wet. Someone, a busboy, another server, she never found out who, had spilled a small amount of water near the kitchen entrance. In the organized chaos of dinner service, no one had noticed it yet. Grace's foot hit the wet patch at exactly the wrong angle. Time seemed to slow down. She felt herself losing balance, felt the tray beginning to tip. Training and instinct took over. She managed to right herself, managed to keep the desserts from crashing to the floor. But in the process, the small pitcher of cream on her tray tilted, and a thin stream of white liquid arced through the air. It landed on the edge of table 15, barely missing the sleeve of one of the businessmen's jackets. Grace's heart stopped. "I am so sorry," she said immediately, setting the tray down on the nearest service station and grabbing a clean napkin. "Please, let me—" "It's fine," the businessman said, waving her off with barely concealed annoyance. "No harm done. But you should watch where you're going." "Of course, sir. I apologize. Your meals are complimentary this evening." It was standard protocol for any mistake, no matter how small. She cleaned up the spilled cream quickly, her hands shaking. When she looked up, Richard was striding across the dining room toward her, his face flushed with anger. "Kitchen, now." The words were quiet, but sharp enough to cut. Grace followed him through the swinging doors into the controlled chaos of the kitchen. Chefs shouted orders, pans clanged. The air was thick with heat and the smell of cooking meat and butter. Richard led her to the far corner, near the walk-in cooler, where they wouldn't be overheard over the kitchen noise. "What the hell was that?" Richard's voice was low but intense, his face inches from hers. "There was water on the floor. I slipped but caught myself. You almost dumped an entire tray on one of our most important clients. Do you have any idea what could have happened? Do you understand how much we could have lost?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Beaumont. It won't happen again." "You're damn right it won't happen again. Because if I see one more mistake from you tonight, one more, you're finished. Do you understand me?" Grace nodded, unable to trust her voice. Her throat was tight, and she could feel the familiar sting of tears threatening to surface. She blinked hard, refusing to let them fall. "Not here, not in front of him. You're a liability, Grace. I don't know why Pierre insists on keeping you on staff. You're too timid, too uncertain. Fine dining requires confidence, authority. You look like you're about to apologize for existing every time you approach a table." Each word landed like a physical blow. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on Richard's expensive leather shoes, anywhere but his face. "Get back out there. Finish your section. And if I get one complaint, one single complaint, about your service tonight, clean out your locker." He didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked back through the kitchen doors. Grace stood alone near the cooler, her whole body trembling. She pressed her palms against the cold metal wall, trying to steady herself. The logical part of her brain knew that his reaction was disproportionate, that she hadn't actually ruined anything, that good managers didn't speak to employees that way. But the other part of her brain, the part shaped by years of being told she wasn't good enough, wasn't confident enough, wasn't enough period, believed every word. "Hey," one of the line cooks, A young guy named Marcus was watching her with concern. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Grace lied, straightening up and smoothing her vest. "Just fine." She washed her hands, checked her reflection in the small mirror near the kitchen entrance, making sure her eyes weren't red, that her composure was intact, and pushed back through the doors into the dining room. Everything felt different now. The low lighting that had seemed elegant before now felt oppressive. The murmur of conversation sounded like judgment. Grace was hyper-aware of every movement she made, terrified of making another mistake. She delivered the desserts to table 14. The couple thanked her warmly, oblivious to her internal turmoil. She checked on the Wentworths, who were thoroughly enjoying their entrees. She refilled water glasses, cleared plates, smiled until her face hurt. And through it all, she could feel Richard watching her from his position near the host stand, his arms crossed, his expression cold. At 9:15 p.m., Grace approached table 9 for the first time. The dark-haired man sat alone, a half-empty glass of red wine before him. He had ordered. Pierre had taken his order personally, as he did with all VIP guests. But Grace was responsible for checking on him since his table fell within her expanded section for the evening. "Good evening, sir. Is everything to your satisfaction?" She kept her voice professional, her eyes politely averted. "The wine is excellent." His voice was deep, with a faint accent she couldn't quite place. European maybe, but softened by years in America. "The filet is perfectly prepared." "I'm glad to hear it. Can I get you anything else?" "Your name." Grace blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry?" "Your name," he repeated, and this time he looked directly at her. His eyes were an unusual color, dark brown, almost black, but with flecks of amber that caught the candlelight. "I like to know the names of people who serve me well." "Grace," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Grace Chen." "Grace." He said it slowly, as if testing the weight of it. "It suits you." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply smiled politely. "Please let me know if you need anything else." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You're upset." It wasn't a question. Grace turned back, confused. "I'm fine, sir." "No, you're not." He took a sip of his wine, still watching her with that unsettling intensity. "Someone has upset you. Within the last 30 minutes, I would guess." Grace felt her professional mask slipping. How could he possibly know that? "I appreciate your concern, sir, but I assure you I'm perfectly fine. If you'll excuse me." "The man who was yelling in the kitchen. Your manager." It still wasn't a question. "He's treating you poorly." That's not appropriate to discuss, sir." "Please, if there's nothing else." "There is something else." He set down his wine glass with deliberate care. "I want you to know that you did nothing wrong. The near accident earlier, the water on the floor, was not your fault. You recovered well, professionally." Grace's breath caught. He had been watching. He had seen everything. "Thank you, sir, but I really need to attend to my other tables." This time he let her go, but she could feel his eyes on her as she walked away. Her skin prickled with awareness. There was something about him that made her nervous. Not frightened exactly, but deeply unsettled. It was like standing near the edge of a cliff, feeling the pull of the void below. At 9:45 p.m., table 17 turned problematic. A man in his 60s, clearly used to getting his way, was unhappy with the timing of his entree. His wife had received her pasta dish 3 minutes before his steak arrived, an inevitable consequence of different cooking times. But in fine dining, such gaps were supposed to be minimized. "This is unacceptable," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "We ordered at the same time. The food should arrive at the same time. This is supposed to be a world-class establishment." Grace approached quickly, her heart sinking. "I sincerely apologize, sir. There was a slight delay in the kitchen. I don't want excuses. I want competent service. Get your manager." "Of course, sir. Right away." She found Richard near the bar, discussing something with the bartender. When she explained the situation, his jaw tightened. "Table 17, the Hendersons. He's a regular customer and a notorious complainer." "This is exactly what I was talking about, Grace. Timing, coordination, these are basics." "The kitchen was backed up." "I don't want to hear it." "Go apologize again. I'll comp their wine." But Richard didn't follow her back to the table. Instead, he watched from a distance as Grace approached the Hendersons again, as she apologized once more, as Mr. Henderson continued to berate her about standards and professionalism. When she returned to the service station, nearly in tears from the public dressing down, Richard was waiting. "You're making me look bad," he said quietly, but there was venom in his voice. "Every mistake you make reflects on me, on this restaurant. I've been patient with you, Grace. God knows I've been more patient than you deserve, but my patience has limits. Mr. Beaumont, please, do you know how many people would kill for your position? How many qualified servers I could hire in an instant? You're here because Pierre has some misguided soft spot for sob stories. But Pierre isn't here tonight, is he?" Grace's hands were shaking again. She clasped them behind her back, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Other staff members were watching now, pretending to be busy with their tasks, but clearly listening. "I work hard," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I care about this job. I'm sorry about tonight, but nothing. You're a disappointment, Grace. To me, to this restaurant, probably to yourself. Look at you. You can barely make eye contact. How did someone like you ever think they could work in fine dining?" The words hit like physical blows. Grace felt something crack inside her chest. She wanted to defend herself, wanted to point out that she had worked here successfully for 2 years, that most of her tables loved her service, that his constant criticism was abusive and unfair. But the words wouldn't come. They never did. Instead, she just stood there, silent and trembling, hating herself for her weakness. "Get back to work," Richard said dismissively, "and pray you don't screw up again." At 10:20 p.m., everything fell apart. Grace was carrying a tray of coffee and dessert to table 14 when Mr. Henderson from table 17 called out to her. Miss, we need our check. We've been waiting for 15 minutes. It had been 7 minutes. But Grace didn't correct him. She set down the tray at table 14 and hurried over with the check presenter. "Here you are, sir. Again, my sincere apologies for—" "Save it. Your service tonight has been abysmal. I'll be speaking to the owner about this." He signed the check. No tip, she noticed, and stood up abruptly. His chair caught on the leg of his wife's chair, creating a brief tangle. In his frustration, he pushed harder, and the corner of his chair collided with Grace's hip. She stumbled backward, reaching for the nearby table to steady herself. Her hand caught the edge of a water glass. It tipped, spilling water across the white tablecloth and onto the lap of the woman sitting there. The woman gasped, jumping up. "Oh my God!" Time seemed to stop. The dining room, which had been humming with conversation, went quiet. Everyone was looking. Everyone was watching. Richard appeared as if summoned by the chaos itself. His face was red, his eyes blazing with fury. "What have you done?" His voice carried across the restaurant. "Do you have any idea? Can you even comprehend how much damage you're causing?" "It was an accident," Grace tried to explain. "The chair. I don't want to hear it." Richard's hand shot out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. "You're done. Finished. Get out of my restaurant." "Please, Mr. Beaumont." Grace's voice broke. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and shameful. "Please, I need this job." "You should have thought of that before you decided to be completely incompetent." He began pulling her toward the kitchen, his grip painful, his face contorted with rage. "You're an embarrassment, a liability. I want you out of here before you destroy what's left of our reputation." Grace tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. She was dimly aware of the other diners watching, some with sympathy, most with the uncomfortable fascination people have for public humiliation. The staff stood frozen, no one willing to intervene. They were halfway across the dining room when a voice cut through the chaos. "I suggest you release her, now." The voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. Richard stopped, turning toward the source. Grace, tears blurring her vision, looked up. The dark-haired man from table 9 was standing. He had risen from his seat with fluid grace, and now he stood perhaps 15 feet away, his posture relaxed, but his eyes burning with an intensity that was almost frightening. "This is none of your concern, sir," Richard said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "This is a personnel matter. You've made it everyone's concern by handling it in the middle of your dining room." The man, Damon, Grace would later learn, took a step forward. "Release her arm." "Sir, I really must insist." "Now." It was one word, delivered without raising his voice, but something in it made Richard's hand drop from Grace's arm immediately. She stumbled back, rubbing the red marks his fingers had left on her skin. Damon walked across the restaurant, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. Every eye was on him. He moved with a kind of predatory grace, unhurried but purposeful. When he reached them, he positioned himself slightly between Grace and Richard, a subtle but clear message. "Your name?" Damon asked Richard. "Richard Beaumont. I'm the general manager of—" "I know who you are, Mr. Beaumont. And I know who you work for. Jonathan Ashford and I have done business together. Quite a lot of business, actually." Damon's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "Tell me, does Mr. Ashford know that his general manager publicly humiliates staff members in front of paying customers?" Richard's face paled slightly. "Sir, if you'll allow me to explain, I've been sitting in this restaurant for over 2 hours. I've watched you. I've seen how you treat your staff. The intimidation, the verbal abuse, the impossible standards followed by punishment when those standards aren't met." Damon's eyes were cold now, like chips of obsidian. "I've also watched this young woman work her entire shift. She's been professional, courteous, and competent. The mistakes you've blown out of proportion tonight were minor at best, and in at least one case, not even her fault. With all due respect, sir, you don't understand the demands of running an establishment, don't I?" Damon smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I own 3 restaurants in Manhattan, Mr. Beaumont. 2 have Michelin stars. I understand the demands perfectly. What I don't understand is how someone like you remains employed." The color drained completely from Richard's face. I didn't know." "No, you didn't. But you do now." Damon turned slightly, his attention shifting to Grace. His expression softened, just fractionally. "Are you all right?" Grace nodded, unable to speak. She was shaking so hard she thought her legs might give out. "Go to the back," Damon said gently. "Get some water. Sit down. I'll handle this." "Hey, she can't just leave in the middle of service," Richard started. "She can, and she will." Damon turned back to Richard, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You have 2 choices, Mr. Beaumont. The first is that I call Jonathan right now and explain what I've witnessed tonight. Given that I'm one of his largest investors, I imagine he'll be very interested in hearing about how his establishment is being managed. The second option is that you go into your office, you write a formal apology to Grace, and you begin seriously reconsidering how you treat everyone who works under you." Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sir, those are your only options. Choose quickly." There was a long moment of silence. The entire restaurant was watching, the carefully cultivated atmosphere of elegance and refinement shattered by the confrontation. Grace saw Sarah watching from near the kitchen, her eyes wide. Pierre had emerged from somewhere, standing at a respectful distance but clearly ready to intervene if necessary. I'll write the apology," Richard finally said, his voice barely audible. "Good. And Grace keeps her job. With a raise, I think. 20% seems appropriate, given what she's endured. You'll also make sure that every staff member understands that abusive behavior from management will no longer be tolerated. If I hear that anyone else has been treated the way Grace was treated tonight, I'll make sure Jonathan knows exactly what kind of manager he's employing. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." "Excellent." Damon's posture relaxed slightly. He turned to Pierre, who had approached quietly. "Pierre, would you please make sure Grace is taken care of, and perhaps arrange for the rest of her shift to be covered?" "Of course, Mr. Valen. Right away." "Valen." Grace filed the name away, still too shocked to process everything that had just happened. Richard turned and walked stiffly toward his office, his shoulders rigid with humiliation. The dining room began to stir back to life, conversations resuming in hushed tones. The incident would be gossip fodder for weeks, Grace realized. The night the Violet Crown's manager was put in his place by Damon Valen, Damon turned to Grace one final time. "Go with Pierre. You've been through enough tonight." I don't understand," Grace managed to say. "Why would you help me?" Something flickered across Damon's face, an emotion she couldn't identify. Pain, maybe, or recognition. "Because no one should be treated that way. And because—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because I've seen too much cruelty in my life. Sometimes you have to stand against it." Then he turned and walked back to his table, leaving Grace standing in the middle of the dining room, her world completely upended. Pierre guided Grace to the back office, not Richard's, but the smaller one used for administrative work. He brought her water and made her sit in the comfortable chair usually reserved for job interviews. "Drink," he said gently, slowly. Grace sipped the water, her hands still trembling. The tears had stopped, but she felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the shift. "Pierre, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cause a scene." "You caused nothing, Sherry. That man out there, Mr. Valen, he was right about everything. I have known for months that Richard was too harsh, but he gets results, and Mr. Ashford cares about results." Pierre's expression was sad. "I should have done something sooner. I am sorry. What happens now?" "Now?" Pierre considered. "Now Richard will write his apology and think very carefully about his future here. Mr. Ashford will hear about tonight, not from Richard, but from me. And you, my dear, will take tomorrow off, paid. I can work tomorrow. Grace." Pierre's voice was firm but kind. "You need rest. Your body, your mind, your spirit, they all need rest. Trust me on this." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face creased with concern. "Grace, oh honey, are you okay?" "I think so. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Did you know that guy? Mr. Valen?" Grace shook her head. "He's just a customer. I served his table once tonight. Just a customer who happens to be a restaurant owner and investor worth God knows how many millions." Sarah sat down on the edge of the desk. "Girl, you have a guardian angel in very expensive clothing." The rest of the shift, the part Grace wasn't present for, apparently proceeded without incident. Richard stayed in his office. The other servers handled Grace's tables. Damon Valen finished his meal, paid his check with a tip that made the bartender's eyes widen, and left without another word to anyone. By the time Grace changed out of her uniform and collected her things, it was nearly midnight. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and she felt emotionally wrung out. But underneath all of that was a strange feeling she couldn't quite identify. Not happiness exactly. Maybe possibility. As she pushed through the staff exit into the cool night air, she found Pierre waiting for her. "I called you a car," he said. "It's already paid for. Don't argue." "Pierre, please, Grace, let someone take care of you for once." The car was there, sleek and black, probably twice as nice as any vehicle she'd ever ridden in. The driver opened the door for her, and she slid into the leather interior, still feeling like she was in a dream. As the car pulled away from the Violet Crown, Grace looked back at the restaurant. The windows glowed golden in the darkness, revealing glimpses of the world she had just left behind. A world of white tablecloths and crystal glasses, of power dynamics and unspoken rules, of beauty and cruelty intertwined. She thought about Damon Valen, about the way he had stood up for her when no one else would. Who was he, really? What had motivated him to intervene? And why did the memory of his dark eyes make her feel both safe and terrified at the same time? Grace spent most of the next day in her small studio apartment, alternating between sleep and sitting on her threadbare couch, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed occasionally, Sarah checking in, Pierre reminding her to rest, even a few messages from other coworkers she barely knew, all expressing support. The bruises on her arm where Richard had grabbed her were vivid purple, a physical reminder of the night before. She stared at them for a long time, thinking about how close she had come to losing everything. If Damon Valen hadn't been there, but he had been there. That was the part she couldn't stop thinking about. At 3 p.m., there was a knock on her door. Grace wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, she considered not answering. But curiosity won out. A delivery person stood in the hallway, holding an elegant envelope, cream-colored, heavy paper, her name written in flowing calligraphy on the front. "Grace Chen? That's me. This is for you. Sign here, please." She signed for it in a daze and carried the envelope back inside. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside was a business card, thick, expensive cardstock with elegant raised lettering, Damon Valen Private Investments and Holdings. And below that, handwritten in dark ink, a simple note. "You deserve better than silence. If you need anything." DV Grace read the note 3 times, trying to decode its meaning. What did he mean by better than silence? Was he offering her help? Or something else? She set the card on her small kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to throw it away. Damon Valen was clearly a man of considerable power and influence. Men like that didn't help waitresses out of pure altruism. There was always an angle, always something they wanted in return. But even as she thought this, Grace remembered the look in his eyes when he had confronted Richard. There had been genuine anger there, but also something deeper. Pain, maybe, as if he understood what it felt like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy. Her phone buzzed. A text from Pierre. Richard submitted his resignation this morning. Mr. Ashford accepted it immediately. You were right to trust that Mr. Valen would keep his word. Grace read the message twice, her heart pounding. Richard was gone. Just like that, the man who had made her life miserable for 2 years was gone, because of Damon Valen. She picked up the business card again, running her thumb over the raised letters of his name. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Queens, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in Manhattan, in a world of luxury she could barely imagine, Damon Valen was probably sitting in an office or a restaurant, making decisions that affected people's lives without even realizing it. But he had noticed her. Out of everyone in that restaurant, with all their money and status and importance, he had noticed a shy waitress and decided she was worth defending. The question that kept circling Grace's mind was simple. Why? And more importantly, what happened now? Grace set the card down carefully, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She had a feeling, deep in her bones, in a place that spoke in instinct rather than logic, that last night had been the beginning of something. What, exactly, she didn't know. But her life had changed. The trajectory she had been on, quiet, invisible, accepting whatever the world gave her without complaint. That path was gone. Damon Valen had pulled her off it, whether she was ready or not. And as the last light of day faded from her apartment, Grace realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She wanted to know what came next. For the first time in years, maybe ever, she wanted to take a risk. She picked up the business card one more time, memorizing the phone number printed at the bottom. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Soon she would call.